What's up, friends? So today we're going to be checking out the new Conjuring film titled Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. So this is the third film in the Conjuring series, although there's been multiple runoff series such as the Annabelle series or The Nun, both of which were okay. The Nun being on the other side of not that fantastic of a movie, while the Annabelle series is pretty solid in my opinion. But this story actually picks off from the original Conjuring series, Conjuring 1 and 2, and it's quite a ride. So Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It is currently on HBO Max. It's only going to be there for a month, but it's currently also in theaters, and the film has a runtime of about an hour and 52 minutes. So this Conjuring film, unlike the other two, is actually directed by Michael Chavez. So the previous two Conjuring films were actually directed by James Wan, who is a fantastic director, but he is just doing the story for this film. In my opinion, Michael did a relatively good job of carrying forward James Wan's traditions and James Wan's style. So the film follows Patrick Wilson, who plays the role of Ed Warren, and Vera Farmiga, who plays the role of Lorraine Warren. And they're like a couple who are kind of like paranormal investigators. And the coolest part about the Conjuring series is that these two are real people. And a lot of the plots and stories of the Conjuring series are based on real life, right? And so that adds another element of ingenuity and, realism that makes these movies a little bit more scary in my opinion. In terms of critic reviews, this film did pretty well. On Rotten Tomatoes, it got a 61%. On IMDb, it got 6.6 out of 10. And then with general Google audience ratings, it got a 93%. So altogether, pretty solid reviews. In terms of the plot, the film essentially follows the Warrens, as I mentioned, the two paranormal investigators, who are tasked with a new and quite challenging case. Essentially, the boy I mentioned, Arnie, commits a crime and kills his landlord and is essentially set to trial, and the prosecution aims to convict him for manslaughter with a death sentence. This is a pretty horrific crime. The Warrens believe otherwise and actually believe, like the boy claims, that the boy was possessed by the devil when this crime occurred, and as he is no longer possessed, he shouldn't be convicted of said crimes and shouldn't be set to a death penalty. So the Warrens, throughout this entire movie, work to essentially prove that Arnie, the boy, was not in his own will when the crime occurred, and essentially to find out what happened, what is the situation with Arnie, and work to stop it, essentially. So in that sense, in terms of genres this film would fall under, it's definitely a horror film, primarily. Horror, thriller, suspense kind of film. Strong, haunting, supernatural, possession vibes, just like the other two films, so nothing new there, nothing novel. It is a lot of a mystery because the Warrens are working to solve essentially what happened to Arnie and how they can reverse what's happening to Arnie, essentially. So in terms of characters, if you have watched and or are a fan of the previous two Conjuring films, you're going to continue to love the Warrens, as always, because they're very lovable characters. They're such a fantastic duo that you want to see them survive, you want to see them win. And so that keeps you motivated through the entire film. But beyond that, the other characters are also really well built. All the acting's fantastic and believable and convincible, so it draws you into the world that they're painting, and it makes you feel like you're a part of the mystery, a part of the lore and everything that's going on. So in that sense, it's very intriguing and awesome. Another thing that this film does well is it keeps you in the dark and conflicted on Arnie as well, because you the entire time are conflicted on whether he should be convicted because he did commit such a horrific crime, or if there is supernatural things in play here, and if so, how can we as a viewer, explore that further, and how can we prove that and save Arnie? And you mainly really side with Arnie just because the Warrens are fighting for his case and you love the Warrens. A lot of the characters outside of the Warrens aren't extremely well built and well fleshed out. There isn't a lot of backstory. Don't expect to go into this film expecting a character piece, because it's definitely not. The real focus is on the two main characters, Ed and Lorraine. And so if you're not interested in those two, you might not like this film. In terms of if this film holds your attention through the entire film, I would say it most definitely does. If you're a fan of horror films, you're going to be sucked in and you're going to love this film all the way to the end. There are large leaps in logic and some of the plot falls short a little bit, but it is a really fun horror adventure that is intriguing to watch, very engaging in terms of visuals and CGI and effects, and altogether pretty solid acting. So in that sense, it is pretty engaging, especially if you get caught up with the Warrens and the relationship and their mystery. You can be even more invested in this film. The plot also bounces around quite a bit. It goes from idea to idea, topic to topic. So in that sense, this is definitely a film where you don't want to think too much. You don't want to analyze what's happening. You don't want to overthink like what could be happening. All the information's spoon-fed to you. This is a film where you really just disconnect, detach, and just watch, you know, and let the director feed you all the information you need. And going along with that, it is a very predictable film. You know, if you've watched horror films in the past, even if you watched the Conjuring series and have a good sense as to their generic formula, this film is going to be very predictable, very relatively easy to see what's going to happen next. It's still a very fun ride, mind you. A lot of the horror sequences and scenes and situations are unique and fresh, and ones that I personally haven't seen in a bunch of horror films. So I wouldn't say it's a fully novel, completely revamped horror film, but it's a predictable but reliable scare. In terms of what's unique about the film, first off, the soundtrack is awesome. They have some really great classics that play well with the time period that the film's set in, but also with the setting and the direction. The music's really fantastic. Also, as I mentioned before, the CGI and effects are awesome. You can tell they really put care into it, and everything's very realistic, very visceral. It really draws you into the world that these Warrens are living in and the time period that the Warrens are living in. The film also has a lot of really good jump scares. I mean, there's a lot of horror films where you can see them coming from a mile away and, you know, you brace yourself. This film flips it, and just when you think you see it coming, it comes from somewhere else. So in that sense, it's relatively unpredictable in terms of the jump scares. They are used quite a bit. So if you're not a fan of jump scares whatsoever, I would not recommend this film, because the horror element of this film relies on jump scares quite a bit to, you know, scare the audience, but they're not necessarily overdone, so it's still a very fun ride. And also, as I mentioned before, the plot is based off a real life case, right? And that makes this situation in the movie so much more intriguing, because a lot of the things that occur in the movie occurred in real life. Now, we have no way of knowing for certain if the devil was involved in the real case, you know, but the real Arnie actually got convicted of manslaughter and went with an insanity plea, and he was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. He only served 5, but the fact that it is a real case really keeps you hooked as to find out what happens in the rest of the film and how the events actually go down, how the events transpire. Also, the film has great directing and screenplay. Even though it's not James Wan, Michael Chavez does a fantastic job of directing and playing with the scene and playing with the characters to keep you hooked and keep you interested. Nothing really gets stale. There isn't really a point in this film where you're gonna get bored or sleepy or anything like that. It keeps up its high energy and keeps up its intensity through the entire film, which is awesome. Don't expect anything too new, don't expect anything that blows you out of the water, but if you're looking for just a reliable horror film to scare you for a night, this will probably do the trick. In terms of who would like this film, I would say most definitely if you're a fan of the Conjuring films, you're gonna like this film. Personally, I would put the first two above this film in terms of how scary they are, how novel they are, but this is another great addition to the series and holds up its own in terms of the Conjuring namesake and the Conjuring legacy. This film is a relatively good addition to it. It's also fresh in that the plot is different from the other two, in which it's not about getting rid of a curse, but more about solving this mystery and finding a way to save Arnie, right? And so that freshness of the plot helps to revitalize the series. If you're also a fan of horror films that primarily use jump scares and frightening imagery to scare, then you're gonna like this film. Some of my favorite horror films are ones that use psychological terror and that really like scare you from the inside. This film is not that. This film is very visceral. You gotta be watching to be scared, and it's more like the jump scares are gonna scare you, and the terrifying imagery of what's on the screen is gonna scare you more than thinking about the situation and the horrific nature of the situation. Also, if you're fans of films that explore the balance and the line between law and religion, you're gonna like this film. And there's some things played with in this film that help to bend that line, help to make the line even murkier. So I wouldn't say everything's 100% factual in terms of law, and if everything would stand up in court of law and stuff with that. The topic isn't taken very seriously, but it is mentioned and talked about multiple times through the film. So if you're interested in that intersection between law and religion and how those two play on each other and when those two clash and what the issues are, how it complicates situations, then this is definitely a film for you. In terms of perfect settings for this film, it is a relatively easy film to watch in the background while working on a project. If you're not too into the jump scares or the visceral imagery, if you just want to watch the film for the story or just to experience the film altogether, then this would be relatively easy to watch in the background. It's easy to follow along as long as you're listening and paying attention, relatively. Another perfect setting would be a horror movie with loved ones or friends, just because it is reliable. It's a horror film that can easily be talked over or discussed. It's an easy film to just throw in the background while chilling after a party, or throw on a Saturday night when everyone's trying to relax and not think and not overanalyze and not experience a true mind-boggling movie. If you're just trying to relax and enjoy a horror film, then this might be the perfect film for you. In terms of similar movies, as I mentioned before, in terms of horror films, it's very generic. So it's similar to Insidious or Incarnate or other shows where it's about a possession and working to solve this possession, solve this mystery, solve this issue that's occurring. But all together, if you liked Insidious, if you liked Incarnate, if you like films like that where there's a big focal point on effects and jump scares and everything centered around the fight between the supernatural and the humane and humans, then you're gonna like this film. So overall, this Conjuring film is a reliable but not extraordinary addition to the Conjuring series. It holds up in terms of scares. If you aren't a fan of horror films, I wouldn't recommend checking it out. If you are and you were just looking for something to preoccupy 2 hours of your time, then this is a fantastic film. Don't expect too much in terms of plot and thought and intricacy, but if you're looking for a relatively basic, reliable, fun horror film, then this is the perfect film for you. Let me know in the comments below if you did watch this film and what you thought about it, and if you agree with anything I mentioned in this review. And please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you liked any of the content in this review. And so now we'll be moving on to the Parents Guide, where I'll talk a little bit about what type of content to expect in this film, so that if you're going to show it to your kids or if you're going to watch it with your parents, you can get a sense as to what to expect, and if you should, make that decision to watch it with your kids or with your parents. And then finally, we'll end off talking a little bit about what we learned in this film. So if you don't get a chance to check it out, or if you aren't interested in the film, you can still learn a little bit about what exactly the film is trying to convey, or a little bit about key lessons that are useful for life altogether. So now on to the Parents Guide. So Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It is rated R, and primarily it's rated R for graphic violence and horror violence. And I would definitely say the violence is the main aspect of this film that would be cautionary for youth. So in terms of violence, I rated this film a 4 out of 5. Some of the most disturbing things you'll see in this film are body contortions and bodies of people, especially youth, that are possessed, that are moving in irregular ways. So those scenes are a little bit more jarring and scarring than a lot of the other imagery in this film. But there's also horror imagery such as demons and ghouls and like zombie creatures, has to be expected from Conjuring films. If you watch the other two and have been unfazed, then this film is not any different. There's nothing too graphic or too gory in this film that deviates from the other two. So if you can handle the other two, you can definitely handle this film. There are sequences of stabbings and scenes where there's a lot of blood involved, but nothing, again, like I mentioned, too gory, and the violence is not really shown, more so it's inferred, and you see right up until the act, and then it cuts to right after the act. So in that sense, it's not too graphic. The film does center around a brutal stabbing, so in that sense, it is pretty graphic. They discuss the stabbing and what occurred, and we see the aftermath of it, and it's pretty bloody. So if you're sensitive to blood or sensitive to that kind of violence, then I would not recommend this film because it's definitely apparent. There's also strong like satanic imagery and satanic messages in this film. So if you're really against watching that type of content, or if you're really against that type of content altogether, I would not recommend this film because it's discussed heavily. Obviously always in a negative connotation, but still it's discussed heavily in this film, so beware. In terms of sexual content, there was almost none in this film. There's one scene where a couple kisses for briefly, but other than that, there's almost none. No sexual references, nothing. So in that sense, it's relatively clean. So I give it a 1 out of 5. And then for language, I give this film a 2 out of 5. There's a couple uses of the S word, but no F words, and very limited language altogether, especially due to the severity of these incidents. I would have expected a little bit more language, but also, knowing the professionalism of the Warrens and the characters in this film, I'm not surprised that there was very limited language. So in that sense, if you are an individual who is unfazed by violence, then this film might be perfect for you, because the violence is the only thing that's really a strong content in this film. So altogether, I would not recommend this film for younger audiences, just because there is some graphic imagery that might be scarring for younger audiences. But if you're someone who's totally accustomed to graphic violence and is unfazed by it and can separate the violence from reality, then I would definitely recommend this film for you, because other than that, there's really nothing too bad or grotesque in this film. But in the end, it's up to you. So now moving on to a little bit about what we learned from this film. I'd say one of the coolest things I learned from this film, or one of the coolest things mentioned in this film, was the idea that we must be careful about what our obsessions and our, fascinations are, because it's so easy for those fascinations to be passed on to our children. Essentially what I'm talking about is, if you spend 20 of your hours of your life working, let's say, working on maybe you're an engineer and you're working on some new technology, there's a high probability and a high chance that if you have a child, that they're going to pick up a lot of those skills and a lot of those abilities and a lot of that interest in engineering, just because they're always around it and they see you so preoccupied with it that they're going to be engaged, they're going to be interested in it. So in that sense, you got to be careful as to what you obsess about and what you do when you have a child, because it's very easy for them to be influenced. And that's obvious. As a parent, you're gonna have a very strong influence on your child and what they like and dislike and who they are. So try to keep it clean is all I can say. Another fantastic lesson that is mentioned and discussed in this film, but I think can be utilized anywhere in life, is the idea of fight your demons and never give up. And by demons, I don't necessarily mean actual demons or the devil or anything like that. I mean just like even the dark thoughts that enter your mind, or the darkness that sometimes takes over some days, There's some times in your life where you're going to be fighting demons, so to speak, and it's very important that you stay righteous and you continue to fight those demons and don't let them influence your actions, because when the demons influence your actions, that's when negative things start to go down. Ideas such as jealousy, situations like that, you need to fight. You need to right yourself, because living with hatred and living with darkness is not a way to live, and it can be very dangerous to you and the people around you. Always look at the light, always look into the light, always look forward and look to how you can help others and how you can build others up instead of hurting others. And then finally, one of the most important things you learn in this film is the idea that love is our strength and not our weakness. And I mean this in every sense of the word. It's Pride Month. Whoever you love Do it with no strings attached. Love unconditionally. Love with all of your heart. And I guarantee you're gonna get love back. Because that's just the way the world works, you know? And there's one thing that really we should all focus on. And we should all prioritize. And that's just love for all. Love for everybody. No matter who they are, no matter, you know, what they do. You'll always be the bigger man. You'll always be on top if you just love unconditionally. And that's just the facts. A couple of the other things you learn in this film that aren't necessarily relevant to real life or cannot be used, you know, in a daily life, but are still very engaging and interesting to think about is the intersection between religion and law. In this film, it's so peculiar because obviously in a court of law, you can't just claim the demon possessed you and caused you to do such horrific acts. But also, if that is the case, how in the world do you convince the jury that this is the case? You know, how in the world do you convince the jury that it wasn't you act when such situations went down? As I mentioned before, the film doesn't fully explore this concept, and because it is such an intricate and difficult concept to tackle, it's not fully fleshed out in this film, but it is discussed often, and the film brings up some unique points. So if you're interested in that type of content, I recommend checking it out. And finally, never promise the devil anything. Never make any promises with the devil. Never mess with the devil, because trust me, you don't want to be on the bad side of the devil. But other than that, altogether, I would say The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It is a great addition to the Conjuring series. It holds up its own in terms of scares and in terms of just horror content. It's not necessarily the most novel or fresh or fascinating film, but it's reliable and it'll keep you hooked if you like horror films, if you like the Warrens, or if altogether you like dark mysteries that toe the line between law and religion. So altogether, let me know if you check this film out, and until next time, catch y'all later.